I'm Heidi Hutner, and this is Coffee with Hx2. Today I'll be speaking with Mark Schapiro. He's an investigative journalist and author, and he has several books that he's written. One is coming out in the spring of 17. It's called Seeds of Rebellion, The Fight to Save Our Food Supply. And he has a book that's coming out in paper that is already out in hard copy. I've read it. It's actually fabulous, and it's on climate change and the economics of that. And it's entitled The End of Stationarity, Searching for the New Normal in the Age of Carbon Shock. His previous book was Exposed: The Chemistry of Everyday Products and What's at Stake for American Power. So welcome, Mark. So glad to have you on.
Thank you. Good to be here. Have a cup of coffee with you.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Nice to share coffee with you too. So you're speaking to us from Oakland, California, correct?
I am. Mm-hmm.
And tell us about your book that you have a paperback version coming out of. You said that you've updated it. What are the changes you've made in it?
Well, what's interesting is I wrote a book called Carbon Shock, which came out a couple of years ago, 2014. And in the interim periods, it was an examination of the financial consequences of fossil fuels that have largely been hidden by the current economic system. And but what started happening, what I noticed over the subsequent 2 years, was how the political and economic order itself was beginning to change in response to climate change. And let me tell you a very fast story which kind of inspired me to actually do some updates and revisions and actually give the book a new title. And that was the finding by a bunch of kind of water scientists who, in analyzing the flow of water onto the planet, began realizing that past patterns of precipitation coming from the atmosphere were no longer predictors of the future. And these scientists, a whole bunch of international scientists led by actually one of our own U.S. Geological Survey scientists, wrote a series of papers and in Science magazine. It's an incredible series of papers. Anybody wants to look at it. And they basically titled them, Stationarity is Dead. And what is stationarity? So from a scientific point of view, what stationarity is that point of stasis that from which you can measure variables and how things are changing. It's actually a measure of patterns of variation. It's kind of the limits to the variation, the bands of variation that are kind of normal from which you can measure change. So they realized that there was no longer a kind of predictable band of variation. They came up with this idea of stationarity, the death of stationarity. And I began to see, looking even deeper in the kind of the end of stationarity when it comes to the economy, when it comes to our political order. And so I wrote this book, which is a substantial revision and update to Carbon Shock. It looks like this. It just came out 1 month ago. It's called The End of Stationarity.
Great.
Searching for the New Normal. And in there, what I do is explore essentially how the economic and political calculations are changing dramatically as we speak to deal with the kind of onrushing changes of climate change.
That's fascinating, but it makes me think as a writer, and as a writer myself, that if the end of stationarity is here, how do we write books? You know, here you are already. That book just came out. It seems to me you actually came and spoke at Stony Brook University, where I teach, and you already had to change it. And you know, it's sort of this. The book we think of as something permanent, and we don't constantly have to update, but it seems like we have to update it even more quickly than previously.
Well, actually, that's a good point, Heidi. It is true. It actually is a challenge to kind of creating one narrative that lasts like right now, because the narrative is changing so quickly on Earth. The conditions are changing. And I have to say, though, part of that is that the conditions are changing so quickly on Earth, but also the responses are changing. The breadth of concern about climate change is expanding. The way that we actually understand the economics of energy are changing very rapidly. The nature of economic systems based on a certain valuation of certain resources, those resources are diminishing in value and other resources are increasing. There's an enormous amount of dynamism. So as a writer, I think I found it as a challenge, and a very interesting challenge, to capture that dynamism. and that
Right, right.
dynamism. Yes.
And are they finding it? And I was speaking earlier in another conversation with Eben Goodstein, who's an environmental economist, and he was saying, you know, we have to change our policies, and obviously we're going to change our energy systems. But it seems like what you're saying is that's really challenging to do, because, you know, what might work for the next 5 years might be completely useless 20 years from now or 10 years from now if things are changing this rapidly. Or perhaps
Yes.
useless is a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, we see things like solar panels, right? We already know someone put solar panels on the roof, not to dissuade anyone. Everyone should put solar panels on their roofs if they can afford to, right? But we know that technology is just, it's changing so quickly, and the costs are changing, and the technology is shifting. So how do we rely on, how do we forge a path right now? With some kind of certainty, if we know that there's going to be major flux and change?
Well, one, we forge a path because there are several things we know. And one of the things we know is that fossil fuels are losing their value, not only to the earth, I mean, obviously we still rely on them for a big part of our electricity, but
Right.
in terms of future investment, in
Okay.
future in terms of where money is going, I think we can actually begin to see that oil and other fossil fuel investments are diminishing in their not only in their applicability to our earth, but in their applicability to investors with a lot of money
Okay.
to expend. So we know that those investment patterns are starting to shift. We know that actually oil, and I've written several stories about this, and it's included in this book about the kind of financial troubles facing oil and coal companies.
Right.
And so we know money's moving away from them and actually moving in another direction towards green, renewable energy. And so we have to build systems that can actually integrate these new sources of energy that kind of value resources differently. So I think there's a way to anticipate these changes. For example, the most important thing about, I think, the Paris conference, and the book includes some updates from the Paris conference, was this very clear severing of the idea that to economically develop, you need to have fossil fuels. There's this notion that, you know, you need to have more oil, you need to have more gas, you need to have all these kind of more fossil fuels in order to economically develop. That the world actually reached a remarkable consensus on this very idea that actually development no longer has to be hitched to fossil fuels. They're no longer connected. And that, I think, was a very important part of
Right, right. Are there some other certain things that you can say we should be working towards and that we can count on in that movement?
Well, we can count on new, unexpected alliances perhaps happening. For example, the alliance that's emerged in renewable energy technology and initiatives between China and the United States, which I think nobody would have predicted, 5 or so years ago. And I'm not saying China is great in a lot of other areas, because this is obviously not a democracy and it functions very differently than the United States. But in terms of, I think nobody would have anticipated the sort of level of coordination between China and the United States when it comes to climate initiatives. So there are a whole array of, and I think then you get into food, and we can talk about food also.
Let's talk about food. I want to hear about your book that's coming out soon.
In the End of Stationarity, I talk about the impacts among many different sectors. I talk about the impact of climate change on agriculture is one area that I write about in the End of Stationarity somewhat in a chapter. There are many other chapters in the End of Stationarity also. The new book that I'm writing is essentially about this idea, and it strikes at what you just talked about, which is the level of certainty moving ahead. What's clear is that the conditions on Earth for growing food are changing dramatically.
Right.
And that is completely clear. You look at all the UN models, it's basically the whole world that is shifting. And what's most, just to get your hands on that I spent in July. I went down to Arizona in July because I wanted to get a sense of what the future of agriculture is. And you want to understand the future of agriculture, go to Arizona in July. And it's hot and it's dry. And in Arizona, they have a $3 billion kind of industrial level agriculture business that's quite significant economically in that state, that is now feeling enormous stresses from these changes that are happening to the conditions on the ground. And there are two things about Arizona. One is, if you want to understand what's happening in other food growing areas around the world, major centers of agriculture, look at North Africa, Southern Africa, Southwest China, parts of Central America. All of them are becoming Arizona, if they're not already. And so much more agriculture is going to be grown in these hot and dry conditions. Number one, we kind of have a pretty firm sense of what the trajectory is of heat and the diminishment of water supplies. So the question is, where are the seeds? Where are the resources to respond to these changing conditions? Number one, we have a very strong sense of what the heat and the water factors are going to be. But at the same time, there's a huge other factor, which is uncertainty, which is this level of the end of station area. There's both not only heat and water, but very high levels of uncertainty. So the question is, how do we develop a resilient agriculture that can actually respond to these changing conditions? And this is what I'm writing about. This the challenges presents to food growing, and two, how people are beginning to think differently about growing food in the face of these changing conditions.
And are they coming up with solutions for this, or are you concerned?
I'm very concerned, and I think where the storyline lies, when we say solution, you know, there's obviously never one particular solution, but there's an amazing array of responses. And among those responses, for example, these are all being played out like right now. So anybody who tells you they have a silver bullet to anything in this situation is probably exaggerating. But there's some very interesting phenomena happening in Arizona and around the world, where, for example, in Arizona, the stresses on the agriculture system have compelled people to suddenly wake up to this fact that is actually this hidden idea that has actually been hiding in plain sight for 200 years, which is that Native Americans, of course, have been actually pursuing agriculture for 2,000 years in the Southwest of the United States, and have devised both systems of water use and also evolved seeds, which involve kind of different grains and such like that, which are much more able to withstand these changes in desert-like conditions. And so people are paying a lot more attention to native seeds and native methods of growing. And that phenomena is actually happening around the world, where I think there's beginning to be a belated, we could say, but nevertheless real awakening to what native people can offer in terms of their knowledge of agriculture, because they've been dealing with changing conditions for thousands of years.
So let me ask you a question. We clearly don't have a lot of time. Temperatures are rising. We're seeing, look at California, the place that produces a significant portion of our, our fruits and vegetables and nuts and so forth. And you all have been in a water crisis for how many years now? So
yeah.
So do we have time to wait to figure? Is this a crisis? In other words,
it's a major crisis. It's a we are. I mean, the more I kind of reported on this, and the more I got into it, I realized we are facing very, very, very serious challenges in the food growing system across the world, and so the question is always a troubling one. Do we have time? We have time. We have, I don't subscribe to the notion of apocalypse, that suddenly we're going to reach a point and just everything is going to dissolve. And, this thing is still happening in stages. And I think we can actually slow down the, climate change is already happening. So we need to understand that we're already in it. It's not like some future moment that's going to start kicking in.
Right.
So we're already in these changes. Those changes include the rising temperatures, the rising sea levels, the diminishing water. So we are in that period. Now our challenge is to do whatever we can to, one, find ways to respond to these changing conditions, which is to develop a more resilient system. And there is also additional evidence, scientific evidence emerging that more diverse farming systems and farming systems that are less reliant on agricultural chemicals, which deplete organic material from the soils, that are richer in organic material, actually are more resilient to the extreme changes wrought by climate change. So there's even a new way beginning to be thought of as organic agriculture has this value, aside from being more healthy or your own instincts to purchase organic because it's less chemicals in it. There are other benefits we're learning that come from that kind of agriculture.
And do you feel this is going to be accepted? I mean, clearly that's not the way big agribusiness works currently.
There's a fight now. I mean, this is a battle that's going on right now. I mean, there's battles going on right now in the within the international food institutions over the influence of the big food companies, and there's kind of growing knowledge of sustainable agriculture. There's some slow, begrudging changes, and I'm not announcing anything hugely dramatic, but within the big cereal and grain companies like General Mills, Kellogg's, believe it or not, they're creeping in a kind of a slow, quiet way to deal with some of the challenges that climate change presents to their food supply. And I'm not suggesting everybody go run out and buy Cheerios, but this phenomenon, these kind of changes are beginning to pressure the industrial agriculture system in a whole new set of ways.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
So one last question, and then we have to wrap it up. As you're speaking, I'm thinking of a lot of people I know who live in small communities. They're growing their own food, and they're trying to get control of their own situation,
Yes.
so they're not relying on what's in the market. Do you see this as a wave of the future? People adapting in their own smaller communities with food growth?
Yes, I very much do. I think one, that this is part of the phenomenon, and I got into this through reporting. I was kind of reporting on this question of seeds and who controls seeds and where the resources. And in the process of reporting, I've discovered that there's an incredible kind of national and international seed movement that's actually been spreading across the world. And that is all about, number one, creating kind of more resilient systems, and number two, holding on to control over their food growing system. So I think that will continue to expand, and but I don't think that's going to get us there on its own. That's extremely important, and it's starting to happen. And then there's got to be a concurrent effort to look at policy on a major way.
I was waiting for that word, policy. Well, we have to wrap it up on policy, because that is key. If we don't get these things legislated and in place, we leave it too much to corporations to do what they will, which are not necessarily the best for the environment or the health of the people. I thank you so much. I really recommend that everyone take a look at Mark's books. They are, I will say them again, Seeds for Rebellion, The Fight to Save Our Food Supply. That's coming out in spring of 17. It's a short book, so it's an easy one for those of you who don't like to read big, long ones. For those of us who do, his End of Stationarity, Search for the New Normal in the Age of Global Carbon Shock.
Hi.
That's just an excellent, excellent book. I saw an earlier version. I can't wait to get my copy of the new one. And keep your eye out for his work. He writes for Harper's, Atlantic, Time Magazine, Yale 360, and we look forward to more. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Great talking with you, Heidi.
Great talking with you too. So you can find more episodes of Coffee with Hx2 on HeidiHutner.com. Thank you so much for watching.